Good evening. It's August 8th, 2014. My name is Matthew Ogden, and I would like to welcome you to our live webcast from LaRouchePack.com tonight. We are very happy to be joined in the studio tonight by Mr. Lyndon LaRouche himself, as well as by Dennis Small from Executive Intelligence Review, Jason Ross, and also Benjamin Deniston. We have a special show tonight, which will be slightly following a different format. We will begin with our institutional question, as is customary, which Dennis Small will deliver the response to. But then Mr. LaRouche will come to the podium, followed by Jason Ross, and finally Benjamin Deniston. So without further ado, I'd like to read the institutional question that we have tonight. Europe's economic downturn initially affected some of the Eurozone's smallest and most peripheral economies, Greece, Portugal, and Ireland. Then it moved to larger economies, Spain, and to a certain extent the Netherlands and Finland. And now it is particularly concentrated in the second and third largest economies in the continental bloc, France and Italy, because the debate about the future of the Eurozone will be focused on them. What are your thoughts on the Eurozone's continuing economic crisis, and what solutions do you recommend? And I'll invite Dennis Small to come to the podium.
Thank you, Matt, and good evening. Well, this so-called economic downturn is actually much more like the free fall of an elevator from the 80th floor of a building, which is an image that Mr. LaRouche has used in the past to describe the current economic situation. And that's actually the very least that can be said, because what we're actually dealing with in the current circumstances are assumptions, prevailing assumptions, that the current terrible conditions of life that the entire planet is enduring at this point will continue based on current practice. Now, what is going to happen tonight is that that premise, that assumption, is going to be kicked over entirely. The entire chessboard will be kicked over, and an entirely new conception from the standpoint of which mankind can proceed forward will be presented. Before that, however, it's important that you be aware of certain facts and certain developments in the world that we're looking at today. We are in the middle of the guns of August. 100 years ago, it was 1914. It was that World War. What we're facing today is far, far more serious. Today is also an important anniversary, which is it's the 40th anniversary of President Nixon's departure from the presidency of the United States. Are you listening, Barack Obama? But what we're looking at today is the rumblings of a war which has in fact already begun. Because in light of the operations of the British Empire and their sidekick Barack Obama, in light of the provocations which they have been wielding and escalating, we have a situation now where Russia is readying for war. They're readying for war both militarily and economically. And the way Mr. LaRouche described this in discussions earlier today was that this clears the field. It frees up the situation in a certain way, because we are now dealing with the principles involved in classical warfare. Now, on the military front, as Mr. LaRouche had forecast would happen in the face of the incompetence and the insanity of President Obama, the British have actually come forward in their own name, in their own voice, to push their drive for thermonuclear war forward. We have none other than Prime Minister Cameron of Great Britain this week making public what the plans are for the upcoming September 4th summit of NATO in Wales. This was repeated in statements issued by the relevant commission of the House of Commons. It was reiterated by top spokesmen for the British Empire speaking at an Atlantic Council event, top editors of The Economist magazine, Chatham House, and so on. And what they stated is that NATO must now take on a new role. There must be permanent NATO presence in the Baltic states, the newer members of NATO, even though that is expressly forbidden by the 1997 agreement between NATO and Russia. The way they get around that is very clever, they think, which is they turn a rotating presence of different people into de facto permanence. But permanent it will be in their view. They are also now going to engage in ongoing large-scale exercises and creation of expeditionary forces to create provocations, as they are now doing on multiple fronts around Russia and China. And they have pronounced that the current problems with Russia, the conflict with Russia, is not something that is passing. It is systemic. They've also announced that NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, needs to have a presence in the Pacific. So I guess that's going to make it the North Atlantic and Pacific Treaty Organization, the NAPTO, or something like that. Now, what Mr. LaRouche said about this 2 days ago is very simple and straightforward. This is an intention to launch war. They are out to stage war. In the recent 24 hours, we have discussed this matter with senior military sources in Europe who were informed about what Mr. LaRouche had to say. Not only did they concur with his evaluation, but they furthermore elaborated in the sense that this is not just some sort of idle drift in the direction of war. This is clearly an intentional policy by the British. He said they have no exit strategy. They have no plans for how to reverse the situation. They are clearly going for the whole thing. And he also explained that the old boy networks, the professionals on both sides of the Atlantic, in the military and intelligence services and so on, have all been pushed aside, and whose voices are not being listened to in the least. Then on the various battlefronts, just over the recent couple of days, we have Obama plunging the United States headlong into war in Iraq. As people are aware, we are now bombing Iraq. It is being done unconstitutionally. The president did not go to Congress, as he is required to do if he wants to get involved in war. That's yet another reason for his impeachment. And we have a situation in Ukraine, which is perhaps the most immediately incendiary of this drive for global thermonuclear war, with extremely aggressive actions and lies being perpetrated on the borders with Russia to try to induce the explosion of such a confrontation. There are reports which have been issued by the State Department of the United States, by Secretary of Defense Hagel, and by President Obama himself, stating that the Russians are engaged with 20,000 troops in military maneuvers right on the border with Ukraine. Except it turns out that right on the border with Ukraine is 600 miles away. That's approximately the distance, as one of my colleagues pointed out, between Detroit and New York. So that's like saying that you're about to invade New York City from the close striking distance of Detroit. So it's completely a lie. But the biggest lie of all, which has been used to take this thing forward, is the lie that it was the Russians or Russian-sponsored rebels in eastern Ukraine that shot down the MH17 plane. What's the evidence? No evidence. What does Obama say? Trust me. Sure. The Russians have presented what evidence they have. They're asking for further investigations, but the great lie is being perpetrated, and this is being used as the justification to take this nation and the world into thermonuclear war on the basis of a lie. It has to be stopped. Now, the economic front is similar. On the economic front, we are also in effect in the area of warfare. You have, for example, a week ago, a top spokesman for the British Empire, Wolfgang Munchau, writing in the pages of the Financial Times, "We can bring down Russia in 2 weeks," he said. And the way we do it is we simply deny them access to the international payment system. This week, 2 days ago, another spokesman for the British Empire, Ambrose Evans Pritchard, who has a long record in terms of being one of the instigators of the campaign to bring down the Bill Clinton presidency, and that is something that we do recall, that what Ambrose Evans Pritchard, said was Russia is locked into the global financial system. Now, that's not true, but it's an important premise. And he goes on to say, for that reason, since the Ukrainian army is about to wipe out the Russian-backed rebels in eastern Ukraine, Russia has 72 hours to respond. Putin has got to invade in 72 hours or it's all over. They're trying to present Putin and the Russians with a fait accompli. They're trying to drive this thing into war. They've launched the sanctions, which the Russians have responded to, and the Russians have now begun a process which can only be described as a war economy. They are not looking at their economy from the standpoint of how are our stock market investments going. They are not considering questions like what's the exchange rate between the ruble and the dollar. They're looking at their economy the way any competent military commander looks at his troops in times of war. Where are we going to get our supplies? Physical economy. Where does the food come from? Where does the energy come from? Where does the electronics for our military equipment come from? And they are systematically proceeding to put that in place. And that is exactly what they are doing. And that on that basis, the financial arrangements will follow that to establish what the BRICS and other countries have been building, which is in fact an entirely new financial system. Against this, what are the British offering? The British vulture funds, the very same vulture funds that have tried to rip Argentina limb from limb and not succeeded in doing so, are now circling over Europe, and they have said so. They are intending to use the fact that the European banks, of course, have immense amounts of non-performing loans. In fact, non-performing loans which are probably not the 2 trillion which are officially stated to exist across Europe, but according to latest calculations, closer to 4 or 5 trillion. The vulture funds are proceeding to buy up that debt at 4 cents on the dollar, as they did in the case of Argentina, and then turn around to try to collect on that 100 cents per dollar. In other words, wipe out nations, wipe out populations, depopulate. The British plan of depopulating the planet by 6 out of 7 billion people. And these vulture funds, 2 weeks after the NATO meeting, which is in Wales, on September 18th, are holding a vulture convention, I kid you not, in London, where I presume they think they'll have the home court advantage. And those vultures are working out their strategy to proceed with the bail-in policy of wiping out populations, and the BRICS and the Russians are very aware that this is exactly what is going on. On the U.S. side, I think the best way to summarize the situation is something that Mr. LaRouche stated earlier today. The President of the United States is the greatest threat to the security of the United States itself under these circumstances. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Mr. LaRouche to come to the podium.
Well, now you've heard all the nightmares, and let me tell you, they don't exist. They're only nightmares. They have no reality to them whatsoever. See, the problem here is people are so sucked into believing what they're told and what is told to them by others that they don't know what is going on in their own minds. What you're faced with, if in effect, is you're faced with the doom of the United States in its present economic form. You're threatened with threats to the existence of European economies. Again, similarly, these are threats. Now, why do people believe these threats? Why do they believe these silly stories? Because they don't know any better. Because they don't know how the solar system works. They're talking about itty-bitty things in itty-bitty corners, in itty-bitty this and that. They're saying this is the system. It is not. Obama's a fool. He's the worst of all possible fools. He's doomed. He's not going to win anything. Don't believe that. Now, how do you understand all this? Well, the first thing is you've got to know where you're living. You're living in the solar system. The solar system is of relevance is what? It's the moon. It's the moon. The power is that of the moon. The economic power on the planet Earth is of the moon. So what are you worried about? Yes, there are tactical questions you have to consider. But when you get worried that this crap that you've been dosed with is somehow reality that you have to fear, it's the fear itself which destroys you because you believe in that fear. What's the basis for the existence of mankind as a human species within the solar system? What is the basis for the existence of the moon? The existence is the moon. What is the importance of the moon? Well, the moon is the source of all of the original powers which define the viability of the solar system. It depends upon the moon. And intelligent people depend upon understanding that. So this piece of idiocy, of belief that this kind of thing is going to work, it works only if you're stupid enough to believe in it, if you're dumb enough to be taken in by it. What do you think is the most powerful force within the solar system? It's the moon, buddy. It's the power which reposes in the moon. That is the thing. For example, what mankind is going to have to do is simply go out there and do what the Chinese are doing. Now, China is doing the job. We in the United States are not doing the job. But we are people who understand what China is doing. We understand what India is threatening to do. We understand other things of that nature. And therefore we say, all right, we are not the number one people. We in the United States did not make the discovery of the solution to the moon problem. We didn't do that. But what happened is our friend, a neighbor, did. They have defined what the challenge of the moon is. For example, you want power. You want electronic power. You want all kinds of power. Where are you going to get it? Well, you're going to go up to the moon. You're going to tie yourself to the fact that the moon, our moon, is a factor which we can rely upon if we use it, if we act intelligently. If we act upon those factors will work for mankind. Now, we are not the best at it. We've had 2 spans with China. China's had 2 spans so far in this effort. China is the leader of the world. Why? Because they took on the question of the moon and how we can use the moon. What are we dealing with? We're dealing with all these, the Pacific power. We're looking about new kinds of power which were never used before. So we know that we can dump this whole piece of crap simply by pulling our heads together and doing what we know we should do. So all these fears, forget them. It is the fears themselves that are the threat. It is the belief in the fears that is the threat. Obama, do you think Obama impresses me at all? Do you think Obama ever impressed me with anything? What was I calling him from the beginning? From the first time I saw this piece of crap running loose in our country. He's nothing. He's a piece of crap. He's nothing. Why are we intimidated by Obama? Yes, well, a lot of Americans are intimidated by Obama. Why? Because they're dumb. They're dumb Americans. Well, we don't curse them as dumb Americans. We just try to put it the other way around. We say, well, you don't have to be a dumb American. All you have to do is learn some high technology processes, and you too can be a genius. Maybe. But that's where we are. So the problem is, the basic problem which we face right now on this podium is that. What do you think Russia is doing? You aren't afraid of Russia? You're not afraid of Russia? Well, what's Russia? Well, Russia is tied to all kinds of things. It's tied to South America, for example. It's one of the best allies of South America. Well, that's a friend. That's not an enemy. But the point is, the idiots, the street idiot, the ignorant person who never learned anything, who never learned any lessons, they all say, you have to fear this, you have to fear that. Yeah, we can get shot. Many people like me have been shot before, but that's not the point. The point is the power to deal with the challenge of the solar system, especially the moon system as such, lies within the means of mankind. China has been a leader already in its first venture in defining the great power of the solar system. We can tap that, and we must. So therefore, the problem here is the farce of believing in what people are told, because they say, well, you have to fear. And I say, you don't have to fear. Yeah, you can get killed, but getting killed is not a good reason for fearing. The point is, if you cannot stand up and reject frauds like this, if you give in to those frauds, you are your own worst enemy. And those of us standing here do not believe in that. We know that the greatest power in the solar system accessible to us now, the greatest power available to mankind in the solar system now, is what? It's the moon. It's the helium-3 on the moon. That's the greatest power. Now, what if we should decide to take this great power, which is there, the moon power? It's more powerful than anything on Earth. The moon is more powerful than anything on Earth. And China's working with the moon. What are these idiots working with? What's their story? Huh? So therefore, when I take about my old friends in Russia, and they are my old friends in Russia, I don't always agree with them. I didn't always agree with them. But when I look at this pack of fools of Western Europe that I see coming out in Western Europe, I say, these guys are geniuses compared to that bunch of fools. And the problem with our European friends is the fact that they're fools. They want to believe in submission to the British Empire. You know I hate the British Empire. I despise the British Empire. It's one of my favorite pastimes. That's what the issue is. The issue is to understand the fact that the power to develop mankind's power on earth depends upon mankind's devotion and power to utilize the power immediately above in the moon. This is the answer. Don't worry about all these foolish people. Don't worry about them. They are dangerous because you believe in them. If you didn't believe in them, they wouldn't be dangerous.
Sounds like we need a collective laughter at Obama as we head towards the moon. So I'm going to take this opportunity to address, to get into what it is that China's doing, and begin by contrasting China with the transatlantic world. Now, China's made dramatic advancements over the past several decades, from the Three Gorges Dam to the first use of commercial magnetically levitated rail, to the installation of thousands of kilometers of high-speed rail, to building hundreds of new cities, to its plans to triple its nuclear capability by the end of the decade. Its East Tokamak is one of only 2 fully superconducting fusion experiments in the world, and they have plans that they have announced to expand the cadre of fusion scientists and engineers by another 2,000 by decade's end. The new development bank of the BRICS, an institution to have an initial capitalization of $100 billion, is to be headquartered in China. The BRICS nations have seen dramatic growth rates over the past decade compared to the decay of the transatlantic world. Even across the world, while Obama refers to plans for Coca-Cola to import more fruit concentrates from Africa as a food partnership with that continent, China has proposed that the U.S. join China in financing and building real infrastructure in Africa and in other developing nations, such as Pakistan and Nepal. In contrast to Obama's recent statements that China is, quote, the low-cost manufacturer of the world, its exports are becoming increasingly sophisticated, its workforce more skilled and better paid, and its products increasingly designed domestically. A July article in the Beijing News expressed China's transformation from, quote, technology introduced from abroad to, quote, technology absorbed and digested to, quote, technology sent abroad. Its work on high-speed rail has become its dazzling calling card, as they call it, reflecting the fact that China is, quote, no longer a taciturn worker living at a low standard of living. On both the small scale of subatomic nuclear fusion research, as well as on the largest scale of cosmic exploration and space technology and science, China is expanding its frontiers and behaving in a way that is suited to the ability of the human species to socially set goals based on the reality of what what must be brought about. As Mr. LaRouche said today, what's real is not what you can already do. What's real is what you intend to be able to do in the future. And the world is noticing. ESA, the European Space Agency, is having some of its astronauts learn Chinese to be able to participate in Chinese missions. Recently, Mining.com and England's Daily Mail are 2 of the most recent media outlets to cover China's plans to return to the moon and explore the development of infrastructure necessary to mine helium-3, which is a uniquely excellent fuel source for applications both in space and here on Earth. 1 ton of helium-3, which is more plentiful on the moon than on the Earth because the moon doesn't have an atmosphere or a magnetic field, 1 ton of helium-3 provides as much power as 50 million barrels of crude oil, which is a number that's hard to even conceptualize how large that is. But to access this powerful resource, of course, we must first return to the moon. And at present, only China has really developed plans in process to make that happen. In the words of the father of the Chinese lunar program, Ouyang Ziyuan, quote, "The moon has huge reserves of metals, such as iron, and helium-3, an isotope of the element helium, which is an ideal fuel for nuclear fusion power, the next generation of nuclear power. It is estimated that reserves of helium-3 on the entire Earth are only 15 tons, while 100 tons would be needed each year to supply global energy demands. The moon, on the other hand," he says, "has reserves estimated at between 1 and 5 million tons. Why go to the moon? He gives 3 other reasons. First, to develop technology, because lunar exploration will require new types of technology. Second, in terms of science. Besides Earth, we need to know our brothers and sisters like the moon, its origin and evolution, from which we can learn more about our Earth. And third, in terms of talents, China needs its own intellectual team." After the success of the Chang'e 3 and the U-2 rover on the moon, China is moving ahead with Chang'e 4 ahead of schedule to be launched in 2017. How often do we hear of underfunded NASA projects being launched ahead of schedule? On the fusion side of the needed progress, China's East Tokamak has just undergone a major upgrade and they're developing an inertial confinement experiment as well, which they call Divine Light 3. Meanwhile, we have U.S. plasma fusion experiments which show great promise, such as the NCSX, the National Compact Stellarator experiment at Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory, which is lying dormant for the lack of a paltry $100 million, while the U.S. has dished out, or maybe better said thrown away, over $100 billion on research, tax credits, and subsidies for that outrageous tomfoolery known as renewable energy. So in expanding areas of the world and beyond it, China is showing an increasingly global leadership. We're going to get more into how helium-3 works, why it's such a unique fuel. First, I'd like to present some analogies for this. So currently the U.S., under Obama, under the direction of the British monarchy, is acting contrary to our historical identity as an imperial force, preventing the development of other nations to maintain supremacy based on past achievements rather than current initiatives. This scandalously backward approach is the opposite of the kind of direction that's most natural to the human species, a constant development and upgrading. I'd like to read some sections from an article, an essay written by the great historian, poet, political thinker Friedrich Schiller, in an article he wrote called "What is and to what end do we study universal history?" He contrasts 2 types of thinkers, the bread-fed scholar and the philosophical mind. So here are some quotes. He says that the bread-fed scholar is one who engages in his work only for the purpose of securing a vocation at the end of his studies. Quote, "Once he has run his course and attained the goal of his desires, he dismisses the sciences which guided him. For why should he bother with them any longer? His greatest concern now is to display these accumulated treasuries of his memory, and to take care that their value not depreciate. Every important innovation frightens him, because it shatters the old school which he so laboriously adopted. Who rants more against reformers than the gaggle of bread-fed scholars? Who more holds up the progress of useful revolutions in the kingdom of knowledge than these very men? Every light radiated by a happy genius, in whatever science it be, makes their poverty apparent. There is no more irreconcilable enemy, no more eager person to denounce heresy than the bread-fed scholar. How entirely different the philosophical mind comports itself. New discoveries in the sphere of activities which cast the bread-fed scholar down delight the philosophical mind. Perhaps they fill a gap which had still disfigured the growing wholeness of their conceptions, or they set the stone still missing in the edifice of their ideas, which then completes it. Or even should such new discoveries leave his edifice of thought in ruin, no matter. He has always loved truth more than his system. And he will gladly exchange the old, insufficient form for a new one, more beautiful. Indeed, if no blow from outside shatters the edifice of his ideas, he himself will be the first to tear it apart, discontented, to reestablish it more perfected. There is no fairer judge of the merits of others than the philosophical mind. All minds work for him. All minds work against the bread-fed scholar. The bread-fed scholar fences himself in against all his neighbors, whom he jealously begrudges light and sun, and keeps worried watch over the dilapidated barrier which but weakly defends him against victorious reason. I imagine that you can think of some examples of how these two categories of the bread-fed scholar and the philosophical mind apply to the overall thoughts and discussions about China and the transatlantic world, even though this analogy is not a direct one. Empire is not a bread-fed scholar. But I think you'll also be able to apply it to yourself, to people that you speak with, who may not want to consider a thought that would tear down the edifice of conceptions that they've built up. We can see the danger in a culture in which discovery is not an ongoing part of life, in which defending the past becomes more important than securing and developing a future. Another example that better fits the distinction between the British outlook and what China is accomplishing now is the story of Prometheus. And I suspect most of you are familiar with the story of Prometheus, the Titan, who stole fire from Zeus, the chief of the Olympian gods, and gave it to humanity, along with the sciences, the arts, all of knowledge, discovery generally, what makes us human. Prometheus gave us our humanity. Zeus, who actually wanted to punish or possibly destroy all of mankind, and certainly deprive mankind of the powers that he enjoyed as a ruler, to him this gift of fire was the worst of offenses. He had Prometheus chained to a rock with adamantine bonds, with a stake driven through his chest, there to have an eagle eat out his liver every day. Now, Prometheus' response to this, despite this agony, Prometheus knew that he was free, that he was not a slave of Zeus, that he didn't give in, that no matter what occurred to him, the meaning of what he had done could not be taken away from him, and that when one of Zeus's lackeys comes to him to say, why don't you apologize to Zeus, maybe he'll forgive you, why don't you be nice to Zeus and he'll be nice to you, Prometheus says, forget it, no way, I won, I'm the victor here, I'm not the slave, you are, you're working for him. So that's Prometheus. Now who's Zeus? Who would have this outlook? It's a real historical personality, and in modern terms this is, for example, Bertrand Russell, that most evil and wicked man of the 20th century, who thought that we should have a Black Death ravage the world every generation to avoid the problem of overpopulation of people he viewed as undesirable races. This man, Russell, who was willing to use nuclear war to force the Soviet Union to its knees to have a world government. The man who opposed the general instruction of science to the masses in favor of an elite and its lackeys as a class. So today we see China taking up the Promethean torch of development, while the Atlantic world under the British stagnates under the yoke of a Zeusian outlook, which sees future development as a threat to its past might. So this Zeusian system is now prepared now to go to war. Thermonuclear war, just as Bertrand Russell was prepared to use nuclear war in his day, to prevent developments which any sane human person would see as benefiting mankind as a whole. Why is that asshole Obama blaming Russia for the Malaysian jet? Why is there a drive towards war when it's clear to anybody who looks at it that the events are not actually what's driving things? What's the real push? And there's no answer besides the collapse of the financial system and a last-ditch attempt to create a force, a threat of thermonuclear war as the only way to maintain that system. So to avoid this direction, we need what will seem a shockingly rapid change in U.S. policy. And that'll start with Congress's impeachment of Obama. You might call that the 0th law of Mr. LaRouche's 4 laws. And then these 4 laws build upon each other. Glass-Steagall's needed to eliminate Wall Street. credit and national banking are necessary to finance the projects that we need. The adoption of a physical standard of energy flux density rather than any nonsense monetarism, that's required to be having a standard of value with which to judge the projects we ought to engage in. And then the fourth law, the launching of a crash program for nuclear fusion, is the most specific and clear driver for economy as a whole. So if we dropped all of the nonsense in the world, all the stupidity, all the foolishness, all the things that are wastes of time, all the things that are evil and bad, if we acted seriously to secure the future that we need 100 years from now, and we thought about it seriously, what must we have 100 years from now? We'll have a future with zero poverty. Absolutely none. No poverty. With secure supplies of materials, water, power, where we're not going to worry about droughts. We're not going to worry in the main about floods. We'll be able to manage these things so that we're not subject to the whims of nature. With safety 100 years from now, from errant asteroids and comets, with the ability to reshape the solar system to our needs, the ability to expand our sphere of power and knowledge, to know more about the beautiful mysteries of nature, that future can only be supported by a platform of fusion power, and uniquely, helium-3 based fusion power. China's taking this on. China's going to the moon. China has an explicitly stated program of developing both their fusion driver science program and, very explicitly, their space program, with the goal of setting up the necessary infrastructure on the moon to make helium-3 mining a reality. And this is understood in the context of an overall view of where must we be in the future, what must we do now to achieve it, and China's doing it. So for more on what makes helium-3 unique, what a fusion economy will be, we'll hear more from Ben Deniston.
Thanks, Jason. So I want to take a few minutes to get right into this issue of helium-3 fusion that Mr. LaRouche has put on the table, and the Chinese have put on the table, and we're emphatically backing and supporting as the most important thing to be done right now. So now, in general, fusion power, nuclear reactions in general, fission and fusion, are millions of times more energy dense than any form of chemical fuel, chemical energy. And you get new qualities of energy that allow you to do more types of work than you could possibly do with a lower quality source. But that being the case, it's still the fact that not all fusion fuels are created equal. And so to make sure people are very clear on the importance of helium-3 specifically, we should juxtapose that to the current types of fuels being pursued under, say, a first generation, or I would call a 20th century mode of fusion power. Now, the current reactions are mostly dependent upon looking at isotopes of hydrogen. And the issue you get with the current fuels being pursued, which are fuels accessible on the Earth, is that most of the energy released comes in the form of what's called a neutron. And the challenge involved here is that the neutron generated cannot be controlled by a magnetic field, cannot be influenced by electrical fields, and therefore cannot be contained and controlled by the plasma. And so what you're left with first generation, or what I'll describe as 20th century types of fusion reactions, is you create products that you can't contain within your fusion plasma itself, and your ability to get useful power out of them requires using the heat generated from these products to then boil water, generate steam, and spin a turbine. Now, if you're familiar with that process, that's because that's how we generate power with coal. That's how we generate power with natural gas. That's how we generate power with nuclear fission power. Now, this is a very inefficient process. In general, you get maybe up to 40% of the actual energy created by your fuel reaction can be converted into electricity, and the rest is completely lost. So if we pull up this first graphic here on the screen, this is an illustration of the electricity generation in the United States in 2011. And I wanted to just show this graphic just to, when we say that the current steam turbine cycle is only 40% efficient, we should look at what that actually means. This is the entire electricity generation, power generation in the United States. You can see the sources of the power coming from the left: coal, natural gas, nuclear, what they call renewable, although they're kind of lying there because most of that renewable is hydropower. And the second largest renewable is wood. So if you wanted to actually look at what they throw around as geothermal and solar and all these other wild ideas, it becomes an incredibly small fraction of anything we actually use because it's so inefficient. But all of these sources of energy, the majority of all the energy generated by these fuels is just lost. It goes nowhere. It's not used at all. The conversion loss is the giant section splitting off up on the top. That's all energy we're generating from our fuel sources, and we have no use of whatsoever. So for the total U.S. energy production, it's about 37% efficient. 63% of that energy is just completely lost to the conversion process, which is just limited by the basic process of heating water, creating steam, using the steam to turn a turbine. You can do a little bit better with certain gas cycles instead of steam cycles, but you're still limited by this fundamental process. So the first generation of fusion fuels are bounded by this same process. If you have a product like deuterium tritium fuel, which is the fusion fuel that's the first generation fuel that's being pursued by most fusion programs today, most of your energy is generated in particles you cannot control in the fusion plasma, and you have to stick with basically a 20th century mode of power production to get your power from this much higher quality reaction. So that's the current, say, first generation or 20th century method. Now, there's been long investigations by fusion scientists of what you might call second generation fuels or advanced fusion fuels. Now, these are fuels that have somewhat potentially higher temperature requirements to get the ignition. But when you get the ignition, the vast majority of all the energy released can still be contained within the fusion plasma itself. You don't have to stick to this neutron cycle. You don't have to go to the steam cycle to generate electricity. You can actually act on the fusion plasma itself to do what's called direct conversion, to use the qualities of the fusion plasma to then generate electricity directly, or generate it from various modes of types of radiations that the plasma will emit. But the point is, this type of process immediately doubles your efficiency in converting your fusion reaction to electricity, to power. But it puts you in a domain where you're looking at the beginning of a real advanced fusion economy. We're actually beginning to generate power, not in the mode of a 20th century steam cycle, but working with the physical properties of the fusion plasma itself to begin to generate these powers directly. And the most advanced, the best available fuel for that, the fuel that gives you the most energy per reaction at the lowest temperature requirement to get the ignition, is helium-3. So it's not a new surprise to many serious fusion scientists and others that helium-3 is the ideal fuel for an advanced fusion economy, for a 21st century fusion economy, not a 20th century fusion economy. So to support the world and support the development of the solar system, we're going to need this helium-3 source. And the other advantage, which I'll get into just a few moments here, is this quality. It opens up completely new potentials in space transportation as well. for this same reason of the fact that the reactions of the products you get is completely controlled by magnetic fields and allows you to use the fusion reaction directly to completely transform our access to space. So these are two expressions of the power of helium-3, why it gives you a higher energy flux density for your economic process, and why it's the best fuel available for mankind immediately today. Now, as has been said, where do we have to go to get this? We have very little helium-3 on the moon, on Earth. But the sun has been producing this stuff for billions of years. It's cranking away, spitting this stuff out. And there is a huge amount of it embedded in the lunar surface, in the lunar regolith, in the lunar soil. And the method of extracting this is frankly not necessarily all that difficult. And so with an ability to get to the moon, set up serious mining and development operations, we have at our hands access to a vast potential of a completely new capability for mankind. A new capability for mankind that will transform the Earth and transform, really, the solar system. Now, as Jason cited, studies have indicated there's upwards of 5 million tons of helium-3 on the moon. And that has been said to be enough to power the entire planet Earth for 10,000 years. Now, if you think back 10,000 years, a lot has changed in 10,000 years. So if you're talking about securing power for 10,000 years into the future, we got a lot of room to work with under that perspective. But to put this kind of in concrete terms that will help people conceptualize this, you cite 5 million tons. How much is 5 million tons? What does that mean? So we just kind of did an example to illustrate one pedagogical expression of what the energy density, the power of helium-3 is. And as viewers of the LaRouche PAC website know, we've been very upfront and concerned about the global water crisis. And there was recently a report on the rapid loss of water in the Colorado River Basin. That, according to studies by new NASA satellites, the rate of water loss has been significantly more than had been realized. And over the past 9 years, mostly from groundwater depletion, pumping water out of the ground, the Colorado River Basin as a whole has lost about 7 cubic kilometers per year, which is equal to about half the flow of the Colorado River itself. So for the Colorado River to supply that would require increasing its own flow by 50%. But that's the rate at which we've been depleting the water availability in the Colorado River Basin. So now say we're going to address this. Say we want to look at the water crisis from the standpoint of the moon and helium-3 fusion. Say we wanted to match this rate of water loss, which is a devastating threat to the Colorado Basin and the entire West, with desalination. Say we wanted to do with desalination with helium-3 fuel. How much helium-3 would it take per year to match the rate of loss that's occurring in the Colorado River Basin? Well, if you crunch the numbers, it's 1/3 of 1 ton of helium-3 per year. Now that's enough to fit in the back of a pickup truck. And that's enough to power desalination to match the water loss of this entire river basin. Now again, to compare this with other sources, if you wanted to do this with coal, you could power desalination with coal. You could generate electricity and do desalination. But it would take, to match the same levels, it would take 6.7 million tons. So 1/3 of 1 ton to 6.7 million tons. Now again, what does that mean, 6.7 million tons? Can you picture 6.7 million tons? If you wanted to put that into rail cars, train rail cars, you're talking about 67,000 rail cars. And if we go to the second graphic, that's the equivalent of the length of the I-5 stretching from San Diego to the California-Oregon border. So I imagine most people have been stopped at a railroad track waiting for the train to go by. You better hope it's not this train, because you're going to be in trouble if you're waiting for this many. But this 67,000 railroad cars stretching the entire length of California on the I-5 is matched by the helium-3 fitting in the bed of one pickup truck. That's amazing. That's some power. And if you think about it, you're talking about, with mankind, it only requires 1/3 of 1 ton per year for mankind to match the requirements of an entire river basin in the United States. So that's the kind of slice and example of the type of power we're talking about. And with this level of energy flux density, mankind can not just solve the problems in one river basin in the West, but we can control the global water cycle. We can solve our water needs. We can solve our fuel needs. We can produce synthetic fuels. We can address these concerns. We can open up entire new resource bases with the higher productive capabilities of high-temperature plasmas and thermonuclear fusion. And we can greatly expand what Mr. LaRouche has defined as the science of the powers of labor, the physical powers of labor. That what you see historically with the development of mankind is that the ability of the individual to produce work is not defined by the muscle power applied or even the energy applied, but the energy flux density and the high technology applied to the individual worker is what creates growth, creates value, creates an expansion of the economy. And that's the type of perspective you have with this helium-3 proposal. Now I want to just take one other example to look at the other aspect which Mr. LaRouche has put on the table regarding the helium-3 age for mankind, and that's the application to space and space propulsion. Now I thought it was useful that just over the last couple of days there's been a very remarkable event, which was the European Space Agency rendezvoused the first spacecraft to rendezvous with a comet. Now we've flown by comets before. We've done a flyby, take some pictures, and pass on, and that's been interesting. But this will be the first time. Right now, this is the first time we've actually put a man-made spacecraft in orbit around a comet. And in a few months, they're actually going to descend a lander down onto the comet and investigate the comet, which will also be a first. So this is exciting stuff. Very impressive mission, very good. But let's be serious and look at what it took to do this. So now I want to pull up the third graphic here, just to illustrate following this case study and looking at the relationship of fusion and helium-3 propulsion to mankind's development of the solar system. Here you see the orbits of the Earth, Mars, and this comet, 67P. So now, we generally think about travel as going from point A to point B. The Earth is point A, the comet here is point B. But in the realities of travel in the solar system, especially using chemical propulsion, it's not quite that simple. We can go to the last graphic here, graphic 4. You see added on here, it's somewhat messy and complicated. You got to kind of take some time to unwind the whole thing. This is the actual trajectory that this spacecraft took to reach this comet. And instead of going from point A to point B, it went from point A, Earth, around the entire sun back to point A, Earth, used the gravity of the Earth to give it a little bit of a boost, went all the way around then, and 2 years later went to point C, Mars, to get another gravity boost, and then went around for another 2 years, back to point A, Earth, get another gravity boost, send it on a path where 5 years after that, it arrives at point B. So you go A to C to A to get to B in space travel under a chemical propulsion mode. So if you followed those years, that took 10 years to do this, to reach this comet. Now again, this is an impressive mission, This is very exciting. It's good it was done. But we cannot survive in the solar system if it takes us 10 years to get to another body. Now, if this was fusion propulsion, and if we use the energy density of fusion, and specifically, again, helium-3 fusion, again, because of this fact that all the reaction products produced by the fusion reaction can be controlled by a magnetic field and can be pushed out the back to give you thrust, your propulsion, which you can't do if you have a lot of neutrons in the reaction. You're left with a much less efficient method. With that level of advanced helium-3 fusion propulsion, it would probably take on the order of a couple of weeks to get to that comet. So 10 years, maybe down to a week, go a little bit slower, a month or something. So this is just a couple of slices, illustrations here, case studies, but the point is that the general principle is that this is the basis for mankind's access to the entire solar system. Now this covers, obviously, defense, the defense of Earth. Asteroids are going to hit again. Comets are going to hit again. If mankind's going to survive, we need the capabilities to get to these bodies quickly, to find them, to know where they are. But it's subsumed by a broader perspective, which is mankind's mission to develop the entire solar system. Mankind's mission to use the moon as the powerhouse, the power store, the base of operations, to empower mankind, uniquely mankind wielding this capability. It's mankind wielding helium-3 that can do this, to then bring mankind to the next level of controlling and developing the solar system as a whole. And so that's, I think, the perspective that we need to have for this, what's been put on the table with what China's doing, and what our response needs to be is to get behind this as the only sane approach. As Mr. LaRouche has said, what the planet Earth now depends upon. The adoption of this helium-3 driver program as the basis for policy, as the basis for any sane national economy at this point. Mr. LaRouche said, yeah, we recognize it's going to take some time. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but so what? You decide to do it. You make that decision. You set that as the benchmark, the metric, the goal. And that shapes everything you do from there. That means what you do today and tomorrow is now changed, even if you're doing the same thing. It's now changed by the fact that it's contributing to creating that. So the most important thing now is to adopt that as the mission, which then defines everything we do from now till then, and gives mankind the capabilities needed to handle the solar system and, frankly, beyond.
Unless you want to make any concluding remarks, Lynn, we're going to bring the webcast to a conclusion here. Would you like to make any concluding remarks?
Just one remark, which encompasses what has proceeded since I spoke here, is that what you've had is an exposition here of what science is here, now. This is us. We are the creators of science. Not the only creators of science, but those who are most passionately devoted to it. And that's what's important.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you very much, both Ben and Jason, for joining us tonight, as well as Dennis and Lynn. Stay tuned. Good night.